Hello friends and welcome back. Today I, a children's bookseller, am going to tell you what my favourite YA books were this year. So these are books that I really loved. There are plenty of other books that I thought were great and that I happily recommend, but these were my personal favourites that I read in 2022. And this covers everything for the age range of 12 plus. We're going to talk about the novels first and then the graphic novels and manga. Other than that though, they're in no particular order, so let's dive in. So let's start with the one that I most recently finished, and that is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo. This is an historical young adult novel set in the 1950s in America. Our protagonist is Lily, a Chinese American girl who lives in Chinatown with her family, and we meet her as she's just beginning to explore her sexuality and realizing that she might not be straight. She doesn't really have the language like straight or queer or lesbian, but she knows that she's interested in girls in a way that she's not supposed to be. This exploration of her identity sort of takes off when she meets another girl named Kathleen, who goes to the same school that she does. And they talk about going to see Tommy, a male impersonator, at the Telegraph Club, which is a lesbian bar. So throughout the novel, this friendship and relationship is developing, and Lily is exploring her identity in new ways. That feels like a very secret, separate part of her life though, to her sort of like Chinese American life. Being set in the 1950s, of course, it is at the height of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and Lily's father in particular, who was not born in America but born in China, is sort of being intimidated and threatened by the immigration department. So it's a pretty tense and high stakes coming of age story, but it's also a very tender, relatable, and beautiful one too. I just absolutely adored this book. I loved Lily, I loved Kath. I also just really enjoyed the different dynamics and relationships that we explored with Lily's family and with her new friends in the gay scene. The romance that develops is just beautiful. It's so wholesome. And I liked that even though this wasn't some trauma porn kind of book, it also just felt very honest and real. And it ultimately felt like a really uncomfortable, tricky balancing act that Lily was trying to do and being forced to do between her Chinese American identity and her queerness. Of being the good Chinese daughter in the midst of her father being threatened with deportation. And while her queerness was celebrated and accepted in the queer scene, there was also racism there for her to contend with too. And I just loved it. I loved the writing, and in particular, the relationship between Kath and Lily just shone. It was just a beacon throughout this whole book. I think Malinda Lo did such a good job of capturing that weird, messy excitement and terror of a first romance, especially a queer one. Next, we've got The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axie O. And I bought this book primarily because the cover is so pretty, and I'm so glad I did because I loved this book. This is YA fantasy based on a Korean legend, but with a bit of a feminist twist. Our protagonist Mina lives in a small seaside town, and every year this seaside town sacrifices a young girl to the sea god to appease him. Usually it's a beautiful or particularly talented girl that is chosen to be sacrificed. This year, the love of Mina's brother is chosen to be sacrificed. And Mina absolutely adores her brother, and so she decides to sacrifice herself in place of his lover. And so she jumps into the ocean and discovers a magical realm beneath the sea. And under the ocean is where most of our story takes place, and it is just absolutely gorgeous. It's so atmospheric and evocative and alive. On the blurb it says that this is perfect for fans of Miyazaki's Spirited Away, and it definitely has strong Spirited Away vibes throughout. And basically Mina decides that she's going to try and figure out how to appease the sea god completely so that girls don't have to keep dying every year. She wants to make sure she's going to be the last sacrifice, whatever it takes. I was just totally swept away by this. I just loved reading it. And happily, this is one of those YAs that actually would be appropriate for sort of 13 plus. Although there is a romance that develops, everything feels, content-wise, accessible and appropriate for a younger audience. This is not new adult disguised as young adult, basically, is what I'm saying. And it was gorgeous. I loved it, and I will read anything Axie O puts out in the future. Next up, we've got The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. I read this in a reading vlog where I was desperately trying to avoid a reading slump, and I feel like this book was the perfect read for that time because I just adored it. This is actually a novel in verse, so it is pretty quick to get through. And it's also a story about poetry and slam poetry in particular. So I am so glad that I decided to both read and listen to this at the same time, because like hearing it all read out by the author, it was just the perfect experience, like so thematically on point. So if you can do that, I highly recommend it. It was a great experience. Our protagonist, Ziamata, is 15 going on 16, and she is beginning to navigate her own experiences and feelings about her body and her sexuality, but also having to navigate the messy realm of external assumptions and beliefs about her body and her sexuality too. That's both society's, but also very particularly her mother's. There's also some incredible exploration about like personal power and autonomy, as well as things like religion and desire. I found this a hugely moving read, and Ziamata is a character that I just fell in love with. She was so fiery and sensitive and just wanted to figure herself out for herself, and yet there was so many expectations and assumptions placed on her that were so full of judgment and fear. The writing is absolutely incredible. Ziamata, as I mentioned, is a wonderful character. The themes explored are done so well. There's just so much heart to this novel, and I could not recommend it more. I adored it. Next up is what I think is my favorite YA that I've ever read, and that is Catching Telecrow by Amberlynn and Ezekiel Quay-Mulliner. This is a pretty short story, and some of this is actually written in verse as well. And basically this story is told from the perspective of a ghost. Beth Teller is dead. She died in a car accident, and her father is a police officer. And so she basically like hangs around and helps him solve a crime. Not her own death, that was just a tragic accident, but another crime that has occurred in a town not too far away from their own. So it's set in regional Australia, and it explores the legacy of colonial violence, essentially, in one of the most beautiful and powerful ways I could ever imagine. I really don't want to give too much away because so much of this is a mystery that just sort of unravels and goes places you're just not expecting. And while it is an incredibly entertaining, moving story, it's also just a work of truth-telling through fiction. There are some pretty heavy themes in here, including things like sexual violence and colonial violence more generally, but it is all written in a very effective and clear way that I think is accessible for younger readers in the YA category. But if you are going to give this to a young person, especially if they're sort of like 13, 14, I'd say give this a read first so that you're ready for the conversations that arise, because this is a book that is worth talking about. And if you're anything like me, you'll love it too. Next, we've got A Magic Steeped in Poison, which is the first book in A Book of Tea, the duology. I actually did do a review of this duology, which I'll leave a link to in the cards above for you. This is a high fantasy adventure kind of story based on Chinese mythology. And the magic system in this world is based on the art of tea making. People literally choose particular kinds of ingredients and sort of like imbue tea with magical qualities that allows them to like influence other people around them or influence their own body in different ways. And so for that reason, a lot of this is very, very cozy and atmospheric to read. There's a lot of descriptions of the act of tea making and brewing and the sensual experience of all of that, as well as food too. Having said that, this is not a book without stakes. Our main character Ning is going off to join a trial because her mother has died of a poisonous tea and her sister is dying of the same tea. And Ning believes that the only chance she has of saving her sister before she perishes is to go to the capital and participate in a trial to become the next kind of like master tea maker for the royal family. In doing so, she'll not only earn prestige, she will also win a favor from the princess. And she hopes to use that favor to ask the princess to use whatever powers and influence she has to come up with a cure for this curse of the tea. I loved that balance between the really atmospheric, like lovely, cozy kind of feeling with the tea, as well as like the trial and the stakes. Like I thought that was a great balance throughout. And it just made this book so readable to me. One of the other things that I absolutely loved about this book is the fact that female friendships and relationships are front and center. The first book and the second book do feel quite different, but I still really enjoyed both. The first one though, like has a special place in my heart, so it is one of my favorites of the year. Next we have The Valley and the Flood, another book that I bought solely because of the cover. And boy, am I glad that I did. I loved this. This is probably the book that like hit me personally the hardest. And that is because this is a contemporary story with some magical realism elements that explores PTSD and mental health. And it's a bit hard to tell you what this story is about without like giving things away. But just to give you an idea, while driving through the Nevada desert by herself at night, Rose, our protagonist, hears through her car's stereo a message that her now dead best friend left her on her phone. So nobody else has this message and she's very confused as to how it's playing through the radio. And so Rose sort of tries to figure out where this message is coming from and what's going on. In doing so, she sort of ends up in this small sort of strange town where her arrival was foretold because there's a prophecy in the town that Rose will come and in her wake, a flood will follow. And so this is a story of Rose coming to terms with and better understanding her trauma and her PTSD, but also interacting with the way that other people see her and her PTSD. So essentially interacting with stigma as well. It's an absolutely beautiful story about mental illness and trauma and how those things shape us in so many ways, but don't have to define us. And that running from big emotions, complex emotions, is usually not the best way to handle them, but neither can you just like get over that sort of stuff, right? So it's also about acceptance and healing, and it's gorgeous. I'm gonna tear up just thinking about it. This is definitely a tricky one to recommend, and I've had a hard time recommending it at work because it's really unique. I've never read anything like this, especially in YA. And of course, it's dealing with a pretty sensitive topic that can be triggering for people. But in my personal opinion, I think mental health and PTSD was tackled really, really sensitively and honestly in this absolutely beautiful book. Then we've got Social Cue, which is an adorable, almost rom-com-y vibe story featuring an autistic main character, and it's also written by an autistic author. Zoe is our protagonist, and she's just finished school and she's managed to score herself an internship working as a journalist, essentially, at a sort of like hip up-and-coming website in Brisbane. Understandably, she's pretty nervous about this new opportunity, and so after a little while, she decides to pitch the idea of writing about her experience dating as an autistic person. She talks about never really understanding like the cues of romance and never really feeling like anyone had a crush on her in high school, and so going into the big wide world after high school not having any dating experience. And this article is received really well. She gets lots of great feedback from people some who really identify with it, but also from a bunch of people who are like sort of saying like, I know you, Zoe, and I remember having a big fat crush on you in school. And so her boss sort of pitches the idea of meeting up with these 5 people in particular who have said that they've previously had crushes on her, and sort of just like doing a little bit of like a fun date/interview and finding out what the signs were that she missed. And so Zoe contacts these 5 people, and we sort of watch in turn as she just like reconnects with them, and some of them she connects with better than others and talks to them about romance and also what their perception was of her and their relationship. So it is a romance story and it is quite fun and light, but Kay Kerr also manages to interweave some great autistic representation and discussion as well. For example, there's a great sort of like subplot about autistic representation in media and how important that can be and how harmful it can be when done wrong. There's also some discussion of police brutality against neurodivergent people, which is pretty hard to read, but also very important and very sensitively handled. So some very important conversations handled very, very well throughout this book, but overall it's got a very light-hearted, fun vibe, and I was just grinning from ear to ear most of the way through this book. And now briefly for the YA graphic novels that I loved this year. Obviously, I can't not talk about The Magic Fish, which is my favorite graphic novel of all time. This is a beautiful story about a Vietnamese American family in the 1990s who read fairy tales and stories to each other to overcome a bit of a language barrier and in order to share their sort of true emotions about different experiences, which becomes incredibly important and a little bit difficult when our main character realizes that he might not be straight. And figuring out how to tell his family something so important and personal when they don't really have a shared language for that experience is really challenging. And the way that the narrative weaves together the past, the present, and the fairy tale throughout is just perfection. It's so effective and so, so beautiful. Then we've got Squire, which is an utterly captivating novel about complicity and the importance of doing what's right even when it's hard. This was just a hugely compelling story, especially considering it's just a short graphic novel. I was so invested, and there's quite a lot of action in here, but it never takes over the heart of this. This has so much heart. It's so good. And then Oxygen Mask, a book I read pretty recently. This is almost like an art book more than like the stereotypical comic style graphic novel. And the protagonist here is a black teen in America, and it is set in 2020. So it explores in a very personal and detailed way the experience of the George Floyd murder, the Black Lives Matter protests, and sort of seeing all of that stuff play out on TV and all of the discussion and dialogue around it, as well as, of course, the pandemic and that hitting quite close to home as well. It's harrowing in sections, but it's also quite hopeful in a lot of ways too. It's very much about family and connection. And the way that the story and the words work with the art, like honestly, was just breathtaking. And then manga can be a bit tricky to recommend because I do feel like often first volumes are fairly light and series can get much darker the further you go along. But one series that I did read from start to finish this year that I absolutely loved and highly highly recommend is Boys Run the Riot. I actually did a full dedicated review for this one, which again, I'll leave in the cards above for you. And this is about a young trans boy who knows he's trans, but doesn't always have the language for it and doesn't always know how to assert his gender in public spaces with his family and his school friends. That is until he meets a new friend who is a very sort of outspoken, just like casual kind of guy. And these two really hit it off. This is one of my favorite like bromance friendships that I've read in quite a while. I absolutely adored it. And they just get along really well. And both of them really appreciate and value the transformative nature of fashion and how you can really express yourself through your clothing. So they decide to start a fashion brand together. This first volume in particular is one of my favorite volumes of manga. I just loved it. I love the exploration and the representation here, and especially because this is written by a trans mangaka too, it just feels so authentic and the details are so specific and so well done. And the conversation is just so honest and real, and I love these characters. So those are my favorite YA books that I read in the year of 2022. I would love to hear in the comments below what your favorite YA books were this year, or if you've read any of the ones that I mentioned in this video. Of course, I have to say a big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you goes to Olivia, Lynette Brown, and Marie for their very generous support. And I'll talk to you all again in another video soon. Until then, happy reading. Bye.